Hi, everyone. Welcome to Both Sides of the Story, PBS 12's high school debate tournament. I'm your host, Alan Janae from CBS 4. Thanks for joining us. This is our second semifinal round of our 2020 tournament. On tonight's show, students from Northfield High School and Cherry Creek High School compete for a spot in this year's championship. So let's meet our participants. First up is Jayla Hemphill. She is a senior at Northfield High School. Here's Jayla.
My name is Jayla Hemphill. I go to Northfield High School here in the Central Park area, and I'm a senior this year. My debate style, it's very sarcastic. I do like to include sarcasm and the occasional comparison that really puts things into perspective. After I started debating, I became a lot more outspoken, and I always have been pretty outspoken, but I began to incorporate that aspect into my advocacy. Having built that speaking skill, I started giving speeches on issues such as gun control, education, and racial equality.
Jayla is one of the most unique students I've ever taught. She's extremely active in the community, organizing protests over the summer with the school board. She's just tenacious, extremely intelligent, and very capable.
Tenacious competitor. That's going to make a difference tonight. Coming up next, Genevieve Holiday, a senior at Cherry Creek High School. Here's Genevieve's story.
My name is Genevieve Holiday. I am a senior in high school, and I go to Cherry Creek High School. I've been debating for a little over 3 years now. I started as a freshman. Outside of debate, I enjoy tap dancing, skiing, and I'm very involved in my school community. A few months ago, I finished writing my first draft of a novel, and I'm editing that right now, and I hope to get that published in the future. I would like to thank my mom for always being there to support me, and of course the wonderful Miss Benham, our debate coach, and also the very knowledgeable Tom Pippin.
Genevieve is astounding. She's an amazing young woman with a brilliant mind and a kind heart. She's very compassionate. She reaches out to her peers and helps others when they're needed, and she loves to learn new things.
Genevieve Holiday, you have now met two of the top debaters in our state. Also joining us, a special panel of experts who will offer analysis of this debate tonight. They are Dominic Dezzutti, host of Colorado Decides, the election debate series produced in conjunction with CBS 4. He is joined by Natasha Gardner, a freelance journalist and regular panelist on Colorado Inside Out. Natasha, great to have you join us tonight.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Good to see you. Okay, time to set the ground rules. Each side will present their case. They will ask each other questions, then have a chance to offer rebuttals. When it's finished, we'll go to our illustrious panel for their own questions, and we'll find out who they felt offered the best arguments. So let's get started. The issue up for debate today is this: are centralized national responses to pandemics more beneficial than decentralized responses? Let's have our coin flip right now and we'll get underway. So, Jayla, I'm going to let you make the call. Do you want heads or tails? She takes heads. Heads it is. What would you like?
I'd like to be the negative.
Negative. That means that Jayla has the negative. Genevieve, as the proponent during this round, the floor is yours to get things started for 3 minutes. Go right ahead.
I affirm that centralized national responses to pandemics are more beneficial than decentralized responses for three main reasons. The most effective responses have been centralized. Centralized efforts can accelerate the development of vaccines and treatments, and the public favors it. My first point is that the world's most effective pandemic responses have been centralized and national. Comparing the lists of 8 reputable organizations or news outlets, including Brookings and Forbes, the countries with some of the most effective pandemic responses are New Zealand, Germany, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan. All 5 of these countries, which are widely praised for their timely and efficient responses to COVID-19, utilized or are still utilizing centralized national approaches to addressing the pandemic. This empirical evidence is a clear indication that centralized pandemic responses are more beneficial. My second point is that a centralized national approach is the best way to develop and distribute a vaccine or effective treatment for pandemics. The US's COVID-19 response has been mostly decentralized and has been ineffective so far, as demonstrated by the fact that we have the highest number of COVID deaths worldwide. However, our pandemic response has been centralized and effective in one aspect: the hunt for a vaccine. According to the US Department of Health and Human Services, Congress has directed almost $10 billion to Operation Warp Speed, which is the American government program responsible for creating the COVID-19 vaccine. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases Director Anthony S. Fauci has stated that 4 COVID-19 vaccine candidates are in phase 3 clinical testing in the United States, just over 8 months after SARS-CoV-2 was identified. This is an unprecedented feat for the scientific community, made possible by decades of progress in vaccine technology and a coordinated, strategic approach across government, industry, and academia. Without a centralized national approach to undertaking the immense task of finding a vaccine, the United States would be nowhere near as close to approving a vaccine as it is now, a vaccine which the CDC says will be released by the end of this year. My third point is that the public prefers centralized national pandemic responses. In a survey of 14 advanced economies conducted by the Pew Research Center, a median of 73% across the nations say their country has done a good job of handling novel coronavirus. A closer look at the numbers shows that people in countries with more centralized responses, such as Denmark, Australia, South Korea, and Canada, were the most happy with their country's performances, with 88 to 95% of each country reporting satisfaction. This provides a stark contrast to the countries with more decentralized pandemic responses like the US, in which only 47% of Americans think that their nation has handled COVID-19 well. Even in Japan, with one of the most effective decentralized COVID-19 responses, only 55% of the country has confidence in its pandemic response, a far cry from the overwhelming support seen in countries with more centralized responses. Because centralization has been very effective internationally, because it accelerates vaccine development, and because it has vast public support, I strongly agree that centralized national responses to pandemics are more beneficial than decentralized ones.
Genevieve Holiday, thank you very much. Jayla Hemphill, you now have 2 minutes for any questions and cross-examination. Go ahead.
Great. So my first question is, how do you think that national leadership affects centralized responses?
So I'd say that national leadership can, in a sense, determine what happens, but also it just depends on the form of government and what each country individually decides to do. It's essentially very variable across countries.
Okay, and how do you believe that that applies in the United States?
So I believe that the United States has had a fairly decentralized approach, and that's why it has been fairly ineffective. And our leaders have not made a strong commitment thus far in terms of prevention, especially early on in the pandemic, to address national concerns. However, it has been effective in terms of getting vaccine development up and running, and that has been centralized.
Great. And do you believe that our national leadership is capable of producing an effective response, particularly to the current pandemic?
Well, for America specifically, I believe that our vaccine is definitely the closest to being approved globally. And then our leadership hasn't been particularly effective in terms of approach because it's been decentralized. But if you look at other countries with strong centralized approaches and adequate national leadership, you see a very effective response to the pandemic.
Great. No further questions.
Very much. With the questions wrapped up, though, now, Jayla, the floor is yours for your case in the negative for 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Pandemics have had an impact and have demonstrably driven the world into one big war after another. One cannot allow the fight against pandemics to be taken over by partisan forces, but instead rely on science to guide the response in healthcare. The science is the same, but its application will vary. This is an important factor to consider as we further analyze the decentralized response to pandemics. So, to first and foremost, directly address the claims made by my opponent, which were centralized responses are better because they tend to be more effective, the public favors it, and it accelerates vaccine research. I would like to put on the table now that decentralizing responses would not necessarily throw vaccine research off its rocker. And that is because vaccine research, it does have to be a national thing. We cannot ensure that scientists in California and then scientists in DC are all going to cooperate. It has to be science as a whole, which is why we have the CDC. CDC is a national organization that is more than capable of handling these things. Additionally, there was also the claim that they tend to be more effective, which is true in terms of leadership. Leadership tends to determine what happened, as was previously claimed. However, I would like to address the fact that currently our leadership is questionable, to say the very least. And in claiming that leadership tends to be more effective, we also open the floor to further believing that pandemics are hoaxes, which has gotten us to where we are. We have to acknowledge that these leaders in power on a national scale do have that kind of pull towards the public. And yes, the public favors it, but only a third of our population has a college degree, so most of us aren't qualified to make a decision like that anyways. The particular question is whether single states, unlike the federal system, are better able to deal with pandemics. Even if the centralized government imposes basic measures to solve a crisis, greater decentralization allows measures to be enforced that are more specifically tailored to local authorities. Allowing the state improved control over their population would not necessarily produce improved results. For example, $1,200 stimulus checks would go farther in Texas than they would here in Colorado because rent is more affordable in Texas. Giving governments the freedom to tailor these responses is the right way to go in this sense. This fact is proven by Iowa's pandemic unemployment assistance, where they paid off lost wages, 50% of them. Housing relief in Massachusetts and Connecticut have proven largely effective. Rhode Island, with a small population, is returning less than 2% positive tests and is increasingly able to move forward with the process of returning to in-school learning. Colorado, on the other hand, was struggling with this as our tests are increasing on a positive scale, which means that more and more people are getting coronavirus and there's not much that we can do about it. So decentralizing this would allow us to better account for these facts.
Jayla, thank you very much. Jayla has the negative. Genevieve has the positive. The question of the day, are centralized national responses to pandemics more beneficial than decentralized responses? Now, Genevieve, your 2 minutes for questions to Jayla begins now. Go.
So does a centralized response necessarily mean that every single part of a country responds the exact same way?
No, it does not.
Okay. And then you said that only a third of the public has a college degree, so thus people should not get a say anyways. But aren't people who live in countries the most affected by pandemics? And thus, if they are not satisfied with what they're seeing, it's valid to conclude that the national response or the decentralized response could have been performed more effectively.
Here's the issue with that. In the countries that you stated, which were New Zealand, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, Germany, and I think there was another one, I'm not fully sure. Those are all smaller than the United States, and they generally have the same climate. The United States, on the other hand, is larger by a multiplier, and we have a million different climates. For example, California and Pennsylvania, those are very different, and climate has proven to be a large factor in our responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so how we discuss these things, yes, it does need to be up to the public in a democratic sense, but allowing the public full say over how we determine these things is utterly naive.
Okay. And seeing as the United States is never mentioned specifically in the question, would you agree that it is fair to consider all countries in analysis of which responses are more effective and which are less?
I think given the platform that we are currently working with, it would make more sense to centralize it as much as possible to the United States on a level that the general population can understand.
All right, we're going to have to wrap up this round of questions right there. In the affirmative now, Genevieve, you have 2 minutes for a rebuttal. Go right ahead.
All right. So first of all, when we're talking about the United States, my opponent has mentioned how our response has been effective in terms of its decentralization. And I would like to counter that in saying that the United States actually has the highest number of COVID deaths in the world. We're over 200,000 right now, and we have had, for the most part, a very decentralized response. And this just further proves my point that when we are decentralized, it's more ineffective. And had the United States taken a more centralized approach earlier, we would likely be in a much better position than we are in now. Additionally, when you look to countries around the world, the most effective responses, as I've said, New Zealand, Germany, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan, they all have centralized approaches. And so this is at least a good indicator that the more centralized a country is, the higher the likelihood the country has of success and efficacy in its pandemic response. Now, in terms of national leadership, which my opponent touched on, I would say that national leadership can indicate, not fully, but it can indicate the efficacy of the response. And I'd say that national leadership that is stronger tends to choose a centralized approach more often. Once again, if you look at most effective responses, the leaders chose to have centralized approaches. Whereas if you look to the United States, we chose a fairly decentralized approach. And that meant that many parts of the country basically had no regulations, especially at first. And since we are a globalized world and the United States is all interconnected, when one part of the country is fairly relaxed and another part of the country has very stringent regulations, the part of the country with relaxed regulations can bleed over into other parts of the country and thus affect everyone negatively. So it's better to respond consistently in different places and thus keep levels of satisfaction higher.
Genevieve Holiday speaking in the affirmative today. We have Jayla Hemphill here as well in the negative. The question of the evening: are centralized national responses to pandemics more beneficial than decentralized responses? Two of the top high school debaters in the state. Jayla, you now have the floor for 3 minutes to respond and close. Go ahead.
Thank you. So thus far, we've touched on a few different topics. We've touched on effectivity and how that depends on leadership and also a multitude of other factors. We've touched on the public and how democracy should affect the public's ability to weigh in on public response. And we've also touched on how centralized responses accelerate vaccine research. So in my remaining time, I'd first like to discuss the idea of effectivity. It was previously stated that currently the United States does have the highest number of COVID deaths. This is true. Unfortunately, this is an issue of national science. Trump has proven to be the main source of pseudoscience regarding COVID-19. Thus, it becomes more of a personal issue regarding how we implement science into our responses to COVID-19. Given the current leadership on a national scale, we have to rely on decentralized government to have the sense to further implement beneficial policies for the good of the public. There was also the idea of looking to countries around the world. Yes, of course, these can be good in terms of several types of data, qualitative and many others. However, all of these countries are very different from the United States. These are particularly smaller countries. We're talking about New Zealand, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, and Germany. These countries do not have 50 separate states. In that sense, it's worth considering that the United States, with the larger benefit that it has regarding its size, we have to acknowledge climate. Climate, in this sense, can look very different. For example, the spread of COVID-19 in California may look very different from the spread of COVID-19 in Pennsylvania. That is because in Pennsylvania it is colder, while California tends to experience some level of heat year-round. Thus, it would not be logical in this sense to argue that a centralized response could account for this, nor does it make sense to argue that it's logical to claim that Taiwan, as a much smaller country, could account for the climate changes here in the United States. I'd also like to point out that avoiding a partisan outlook on this, effectivity can be brought into question simply regarding the state leaders. Yes, the state leaders do vary, and there are many separate partisan beliefs here in the United States. However, even with these partisan beliefs that we have here in the States, it does simply make more sense to implement these things on a smaller scale in states that will be better able to implement them effectively versus a larger scale where we are all forced under the same beliefs.
Thank you very much, Jayla Hemphill. Our topic tonight about national responses to pandemics. Finally, Genevieve Holiday, you have 1 minute to close. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin by first refuting a few of my opponent's points, and then going back and reaffirming my own. So my opponent speaks of that in my evidence, they're all smaller countries. First of all, Germany and Taiwan have very large populations, and thus it's not just countries with small populations. But additionally, if you look to large countries like China, which has 23 provinces and a population 4 times the size of the United States, although the outbreak began there, once they implemented a national level lockdown, they have basically gotten rid of COVID in their country, and they are now beginning to reopen things up. So that's another example of a centralized response that has been fairly effective in keeping COVID out of the way. And then additionally, I would just like to point out that vaccinating people is most effective when it's done through a national centralized approach. And the same goes for the public support. People are more satisfied when their government chooses a centralized approach than when they choose a decentralized approach. Not to mention that all of the centralized approaches around the world, or not all of them, but the most effective centralized approaches around the world have had the fewest COVID deaths, and typically decentralized approaches have not shown to be more effective.
Genevieve, we'll have to wrap it up right there. Genevieve Holiday from Cherry Creek High School, thank you very much. And Jayla Hemphill from Northfield High, thank you very much. Very complicated question tonight. 2 excellent debaters. Are centralized national responses to pandemics more beneficial than decentralized responses? Let's go to our panel of experts right now and get their thoughts on what they saw. Dominic, take it away.
Thank you, Alan. Genevieve, Jayla, a fantastic debate, but your work is not over. Get a couple questions for both Natasha and myself. We're going to start with Genevieve. Natasha, why don't you ask Genevieve your first question?
You spent a lot of time talking about cases and that load on a country. But in addition to that, the economic impact is immense, particularly in a country as diverse as the United States. So let's bring it back to home in Colorado, where you might have a rural environment with an economy that's very different than, say, the Denver corridor. Why would a national response work with places that are so unique and different, particularly not on the public health perspective only, but also on the economic standpoint?
For sure. So what you'll see is that national responses you can still tailor them, although less so, to specific places. You wouldn't do an stringent lockdown in every single place, but with a national response, there is some flexibility to adjust for population levels and for different factors. Like you can factor that into a system, and in essence, you have a national system rather than one single national response that you implement everywhere. So there is actually some degree of leniency for different places.
And Genevieve, my question gets into the speed of response. When you have a centralized response from a country, let's take the United States, for example, and a change happens right there in the field. Let's say in Colorado, isn't a decentralized approach, putting Colorado in charge, going to be able to handle the quick changes better than a national response, even if that national response, the centralized response, is catered to the states?
So in terms of speed, the decentralized response may work more quickly. However, if the locality isn't on top of that, or if you've seen many parts of the US just haven't really done anything about the pandemic in the past, then that can be more detrimental. So it's all a balance. For a national pandemic response, you do sacrifice a little bit of speed in order to achieve national unity and making sure that the virus does not spread to more parts of the country. So in essence, there are some setbacks, but overall the benefits outweigh the harms.
Well, Jayla, it's your turn. Natasha, let's get your question for Jayla.
You spoke quite a bit about President Trump's leadership, or lack of leadership, on this particular topic, but an administration is not just one person. And in particular, you mentioned the CDC, which is a federally funded organization. So why can't those sort of programs, the CDCs of the world or other parts of the administration, still be effective?
course, those can be effective. However, we have experienced utter denial of their effectivity, such as the defunding of the CDC, or we've experienced kind of that pacification of the CDC, where they haven't been allowed to provide the same information that they were at one point. I did speak a lot about President Trump, and of course, everybody has their own ideas regarding those things. However, we do have to acknowledge that we are discussing the same administration that gave paper towels to Puerto Rico after a hurricane. And we really have to call into question in their own judgment, because at the end of the day, President Trump is kind of at the top of the food chain in regards to that, and he is going to affect everything else down to the bottom, if that makes sense.
So Jayla, my question for you is, does a decentralized approach mean different standards of safety, meaning the idea of masks? Is that a problem?
Not necessarily. Decentralizing government does not mean decentralizing science. The science thus far has shown that masks are more effective in preventing the spread of COVID-19. So in a decentralized approach, yes, there will be varying safety standards. For example, the Rhode Island example that I brought up with them returning to in-school learning. In Rhode Island, that, given the percentage of positive tests that they do have, is more acceptable than it would be here in Colorado. So we do have to take into consideration those individual variances between states.
Great responses from both our debaters. Now you got to give us a second to see if Natasha and I can figure this out.
When you get into the semifinals, it is so tough when you have these great debaters. Dominic, thank you very much. We're going to give our panel a moment to consider whom they felt won this debate. That'll give me a moment to let you know that we are right smack dab in the middle of this year's tournaments. Our 2020 tournament features 12 total debates, including a full consolation bracket, so you will get a chance to see all of our students debate multiple times this fall. To catch up on any of the episodes, you can go to pbs12.org. So, panel, do you have a decision? I'll stretch that sentence out to give you one more second.
Every second is appreciated, Alan. Thank you so much. A topic that has been debated literally around the world. You both did a wonderful job. I think leaders around the world would be able to take a lot of great cues from both of your points. It is Natasha and I's job to come up with a winner, as difficult as it might be. Genevieve, we decided that your argumentation won the day, but a wonderful debate. And Genevieve, congratulations.
Thank you.
All right, congratulations to you, Genevieve Holiday, as well as Jayla Hemphill. Terrific debate today, well-researched by the two of you. So here's what it means, Genevieve. You will now go on to the championship round. Jayla, you'll see you in the third place match. And you both gave our viewers a wonderful debate tonight. You should both be extremely proud. That's all the time we have for our program tonight. I want to thank our excellent students for accepting our challenge and for participating in our debate. I also want to thank our esteemed panel for sharing their thoughts. And finally, we want to thank you for tuning in. It is the support of viewers like you and our sponsors that helps to make this show a reality. You can catch up on past episodes of this program on pbs12.org, and you can catch me on CBS4 for all of the latest news and information impacting Colorado. For everybody here at PBS 12, I'm Alan Janae. Thanks for watching, and that is Both Sides of the Story.